Snap. Good morning, everybody. How y'all doing? All right, did y'all eat a little bit? Okay, somebody stole the last donut. I think it was a young person, and I was kind of mad. So it's really, really wonderful. How did y'all sleep? Sleep okay? Okay. So I just want to welcome everybody again to the space. It is wonderful to see each and every one of you. Heath and I have been looking over many of your bios and profiles over the last several months, so it's nothing like actually meeting you in real life. And I know for me it's been a pleasure, most of all, to sort of just get to know folks in the space. So in that spirit, we also want to make sure that we reset our commitment to stretching ourselves to each other, stretching ourselves to different ideas, stretching ourselves to learn, to think carefully, and to be in this space together so that we can come out of this ready to do the hard work of justice. So again, thank you for coming this morning. I'm gonna have Heath come up to introduce the panel.
Hello. That's nice. Yeah, so I would follow Niall just to say it's so nice to put, a smiling face with the profile and picture that we've been reading over for the last 6 months. And, to just invite everyone to be here with us. We're just so happy that everyone came together from lots of different spaces and some folks really far away. So it's really wonderful just to have this space together. So I'm going to introduce this panel informally. This panel is Wake, and the respondent moderator for this panel is Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. She's from our Department of African American Studies. And then the panel is Tyler Davis, who's from Baylor, and Emmanuela Kucik from Princeton, and Samuel Ng from NYU, and Christina Sharpe from Tufts. And just to remind you that the grad students have 15 to 20 minutes on their papers, and Professor Sharpe will have 20 to 30 minutes on her paper. So no need for any more. Join me in welcoming this panel.
Good morning. I have the same struggle every time these days I come to speak. I have some different pair of glasses that I can't quite figure out how to work. So hopefully I don't actually need them. Thank you so much. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me? Or should I? Okay, let me move that down. So first, thanks to the organizers, Niall and Heath, for the work that they've done on putting together what's an amazing conference, and for the invitation to participate. Thanks to my panel, the shared panel group that I'm a part of, for sending their papers early and for the work that they're doing. Thanks to Dion Worthy for her patience as I worked to work out my schedule. She was very patient with me. And thank you for allowing me to be here to participate in this work. I'm sorry that I won't be able to be here for the entire conference. So part of what I'm presenting today is from my book, In the Wake on Blackness and Being, though what you hear is not exactly as it appears in the book. The other parts are work in progress toward my current project, which is called Thinking Juxtapositionally. So part 1, Black Still Life. There's certain words in the Wake that exceeded my grasp. That is, there were words and ideas that were important to the thinking and the writing of the book, but that appeared even more places than I remembered. One of those words is still, as in without waves or violent commotion in the air or water, as in constant continual use, continued until now, as in an ordinary photograph as opposed to a moving image, as in predicatively of a person, as in to hold oneself still, and so on. The still of Cornelia Parker's installation, Hanging Fire, Suspected Arson, that's the cover of the book, composed of charcoal, wire, pins, and nails that looks like something coming apart, something coming back together, something held still in suspension. Beginning with the part of the dedication that reads, quote, to all Black people who still insist life and being into the wake. To Dion Brand's verso 55, in which those Africans held in the holding cells of the slave forts are beheld as they reconfigure in joy and wonder, the traces of their former selves rising up to greet the returned whom they did not expect to survive. Quote, they felt happy for us. We were still alive. Yes, we are still alive, we said, and we had returned to thank them. You are still alive, they said. Yes, we are still alive. We said, yes, yes, we are still alive. How lemon, they said. I just skipped something, pardon me. You are still alive, they said. Yes, we are still alive. They looked at us like violet teas, they drank us. We said, here we are. They said, you are still alive. We said, yes, yes, we are still alive. How lemon, they said. How blue like fortune. We took the bottle of rum from our veins. We washed their faces. We sewed their thin skins. We were pilgrims. They were gods. They said with wonder and admiration, you are still alive, like hydrogen, like oxygen, end quote. Still continues in the book into a moment in Beloved that finds Setha, heavily pregnant, quote, walking on 2 feet meant for standing still near a kettle, still at the churn, still at the tub, an ironing board. And that stillness that is durational and filled with labor and motion is juxtaposed with Amy Denver, who when Setha hears not her movement but her standing still, she thinks that stillness must surely mean more violence in the form of another white boy with mossy teeth. Still continues in my reading of the image of the little girl, survivor of the January 12, 2010 devastating earthquake in Haiti, who has a piece of tape with the word ship written on it affixed to her forehead, and at whose face I looked and looked at, and into over the course of several years, until I saw that in the midst of all that brought her to the pages of the Washington Post, there was a leaf in her still neat braids. There's the durational moving still of the wake in water. A ship moving through water generates a particular pattern of waves. The bow wave is in front of the ship, and that wave then spreads out in the recognizable V pattern on either side of and then behind the ship. The size of the bow wave dictates how far out the wave starts. Waves that occur in the wake of the ship move at the same speed as the ship. From at least the 16th century onward, a major part of the ocean engineering of ships has been to minimize the bow wave and therefore to minimize the wake, because wakes slow down the movement of the ship. But the effect of trauma is the opposite of that. It's to make maximal the wake. The transverse waves are those waves that run through the back. They're perpendicular to the direction of the motion of the ship. Transverse waves look straight, but they're actually arcs of a circle. And every time that boat is moving through water, it has the potential to generate a new wave. Certainly that slave ship Zong, once named Zorg, which means care in Dutch, far away from any land mass, would have been in deep water, and any object or person thrown overboard would have been in deep water waves. Once in the water, that thrown overboard person would have experienced the circular or bobbing motion of the wake and would have been carried by that wake for at least a short period of time. It's likely, though, that sick and emaciated or close to it, many of those enslaved people would have had very little body fat, so their bodies would have been denser than seawater. It's likely then that those Africans thrown overboard would have floated just a short while, and only because of the shapes of their bodies. It is likely, too, that they would have sunk relatively quickly and drowned relatively quickly as well. And then there were the sharks that always followed in the wake of those ships. There have been studies done on whales that have died and sunk to the bottom of the seafloor. Those studies show that within a few days, the whales' bodies are picked almost clean by benthic organisms, those organisms that live on the seafloor. I now know, and I know this actually because I went to University of Miami and for a conversation about the book, and there was a woman there who was an oceanographer, and she told me a little bit more about whale falls, because when I was writing the book, I did meet with my colleague who is in ocean and geographic sciences, so she could explain to me actually the science of wakes. Though, you know, I wrote it out with my understanding of that. So what I now know is that a whale fall is what it's called when those whales sink to the bottom of the ocean. And a whale fall is quite literally the afterlife of a whale. That is, it is the way the whale's lives live on, is the way the whale lives on as part of the deep sea ecosystem. So my colleague Anne tells me it's most likely that a human body would not make it to the seafloor intact. What happened to the bodies, I ask her, by which I mean what happened to the components of their bodies in salt water. Because nutrients cycle through the ocean, the process of organisms eating organisms is the cycling of nutrients through the ocean. The atoms of those people who were thrown overboard are out there in the ocean even today. They were eaten, organisms processed them, and those organisms were in turn eaten and processed, and the cycle continues. Around 90 to 95% of the tissues of things that are eaten in the water column get recycled. As Anne tells me, nobody dies of old age in the ocean. The amount of time it takes for a substance to enter the ocean and then leave the ocean is called residence time. Human blood is salty, and sodium has a residence time of 260 million years. And what happens to that energy that's produced in the waters? It continues like atoms cycling in residence time. We Black people exist in the residence time of the wake, a time in which, to quote Morrison, everything is now. It is all now. Those Africans jumped, thrown, dumped overboard in Middle Passage, in the Mediterranean Sea, in the Pacific Ocean, they're with us still in the time of the wake known as residence time. And still, the word still, as I argue in the book, has a different life for Black people in the wake, a life I describe as anagrammatical. So think about the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Matthew in Haiti in October 2016, and the relentlessly circulating images of disaster and devastation that often occluded Black life still being lived, occluded the work of preparation, sustenance, and survival that Haitians were engaged in before, during, and after the storm made land. Quote, "The story of Matthew in Haiti," one colleague wrote, "is not the number dead, but the number that lived, not the chaos and disorder, but the organization and response," end quote. And it's that kind of work, the organization and response in the midst of ongoing violence and destruction, that's part of what I wanted to think of as wake work, a mode of inhabiting and rupturing this episteme with our known, lived, and yet still unimaginable lives. In the midst of the fact of Black life as proximate to death, I wanted to think about what I called wake work as that work that attends to physical, social, and figurative death, but also to the largeness that's Black life lived still, Black life insisted from death. For to be in the wake is to recognize the ways that we are constituted through and by continued vulnerability to overwhelming force, though we are not known only to ourselves and to each other by that force. Living still, we perform wake work from the knowledge that there is nothing natural about these disasters. And in the wake, the semiotics of the slave ships continue, from those forced movements of the enslaved to the forced movements of the migrant and the refugee, to the regulation of Black people in North American streets and neighborhoods, to those ongoing crossings of and drownings in the Mediterranean Sea, to the reappearance of slave auctions in Libya in 2017, to the brutal colonial reimaginings of the slave ship and the Ark and their reappearance in everyday life in the form of the prison, the camp, and the school. Wake work, I think, requires that we think through containment, regulation, punishment, capture, captivity, and the ways that manifold representations of Blackness become the symbol par excellence for the less than human being condemned to death. It requires us to think about Black flesh, Black optics, and ways of producing enfleshed and embodied work. To think and imagine the ways that the hold cannot and does not hold, even as the hold remains in the forms that I've mentioned before, the prison, but also the womb, and elsewhere in and as the tension between being and instrumentality that is Black being in the wake. At the stake is not recognizing anti-Blackness as total climate. At stake is not recognizing the insistent Black visual sonic resistance to that imposition of non-being. Part 2, open casket. Quote, "Emmett Till's 60-year-old murder took hold of Dana Schutz, and she struggled with and against the urge to paint it," from a New Yorker profile of the painter. Quote, "Maybe you can't see the things you want. Here are these Black bodies, and maybe there are ways in which you can't have access to them." From Okwi Okpowasili, speaking of the set design of Poor People's TV Room. So when Mamie Till Bradley refuses to have those images not be shown, it's because she wants to make clear that what has been done to her barely turned 14-year-old son, Emmett, she wants to make clear what has been done to her barely 14-year-old son, Emmett Lewis Till. She says, "Let the people see what I've seen." And her act says, look at what they did to my son. This is my son. Look at what they did to him. With the publication of those images in Jet Magazine and the Chicago Defender, we see her insistence that the brutal violence that her son has been subjected to be seen. It's a seeing together as well, I think, as Samuel Eng's paper makes clear. So Dana Schutz's painting, Open Casket, which you're looking at right now, is part of the 2017 Whitney Biennial, and it's derived from those famous photographs of Emmett Till in his coffin, but its rendering of Till's face and its circulation in an art space and more take that unobscured violence and seems to me make it abstract. So that Mamie Till Bradley wanted to make real that violence, to make it visible and irrefutable. Look at what they've done to my son. And those forces, white supremacy, violent abduction, torture, suffering, murder, that Mamie Till wanted to make absolutely clear seem to me to be abstracted in Schutz's painting. As well as in her defense of the work that she made it because she's a mother and because she's thought it is better to try and fail at doing the hard thing than to not do it all, that she made it out of empathy. But we know that photographs and other images of Black people suffering don't actually do the work that one thinks, desires, or imagines that it can or should do. All too often, such images hit in the register of abandonment, even or especially when they purport to, quote, humanize Black people. That is, when they purport to make manifest a humanity that we already know to be present, or that we don't accept as the sort of ground from which we begin to speak and act. To stand in front of the painting, I think, is to enter into a series of relations. And so what is it that Open Casket calls forth? What is it that it calls on various we's to do, think, and feel in the wake of slavery, which is to say, in an ongoing present of murder, subjection, repression, but also resistance? What is the viewer's relation to the Black brutalized body in the painting? The painter assumes an intimate relation to that body. The viewer is put in an intimate relation to that body. Are those the same intimate relations? And it seems to me that the viewer's relation to the Black body in Open Casket is not the same relation called forth, for example, in another painting in the show, Henry Taylor's The Times They Ain't A-Changin' Fast Enough, which is a painting of the murder of Philando Castile. In Taylor's painting, the viewer is positioned in the car with Mr. Castile, facing the white and white supremacist strong arm of the law. And so think here, it's sort of counter to Darren Wilson's testimony Darren Wilson's testimony of his weakness in the face of Michael Brown's alleged superhuman strength, and his language and the language of the state of the accusation that Brown committed, quote, strong arm robbery. Here it's quite clear that the strong arm is the arm of the law. Taylor's painting, too, stages the aftermath of a murder. To view Taylor's painting is to be placed inside of that car, placed in the position, in fact, of Castile's partner, Diamond Reynolds, and their 4-year-old daughter, Deanna. Like Bradley, Reynolds has insisted that the world not look away from this, that they try to look and see what has been done to her fiancé. Diamond Reynolds has witnessed and filmed Castile's assassination, all the while knowing that she may be next. But the we that knows that we may be next is distinct from the we that doesn't. And that knowledge of fungibility both produces and extends the relation that I was trying to think through as wake work. And it's wake work that I see in Taylor's painting. And it's also wake work that I see in Parker Bright's placing his body in front of Open Casket, if you've seen those images of Parker Bright standing there. Awake in front of the painting, a sitting with and in the knowledge that what has happened should never have happened, and that it does not and should not bear certain kinds of obfuscating abstraction. So here I want to offer a brief note, because this is part of my new project called Thinking Juxtapositionally. And I want to offer a note that in thinking about Schutz's and Taylor's paintings, I'm also thinking them alongside a number of other works, including Steve McQueen's short 2-channel film Ashes, 2002 to 2015, but also the Equal Justice Initiative project on lynching in Alabama. And I just want to show 2 images from there, right, in which they collect from 800 lynchings in Alabama, in which they collect dirt from the places where people were lynched, and if they know the names, they put the name on the dirt. But there are 800 of them, and they're stunning. And so I want to, in this project, sort of continue thinking about the wake, continue thinking about the ship and residence time, but I want to think residence time in the register of the soil, right? So what kinds of things remain in the soil over time, and how do we think about that? Right. So I'm continuing with residence time, with wakes and ships and soil composition and dead zones. So now part 3, Atlantique. Water is an element which remembers the dead. Toni Morrison, The Sight of Memory. The sea was slake gray of what was left of my body, and the white waves, I remember, Kamal Brathwaite, Dream Haiti, Dream Stories 2. All beginnings in water, all ending in water. Dion Brand, A Map to the Door of No Return. Mati Diop's 2009 short film Atlantiques begins with a specter, a disembodied voice of a young man and a close shot of the rusting tape player from which his voice comes. Instead of his body, we hear the squeaking of the tape. We see the corroded wheels moving, and we hear him speaking. We soon learn that the speaker is dead. He's drowned during what was his second crossing of the Atlantic from Senegal to Spain. The voice on the tape describes being on a pirogue in the middle of the ocean. You can barely see the pirogue there. These are stills from the film. A terrible scene, a terrifying scene, he says. And as he speaks, the image of a small pirogue in the middle of the ocean appears on the screen. The speaker, who we will come to know, is named Sareen Sek, and he recounts the exhaustion and the terror of this journey, a terror that he tells us is interrupted by the feverish, sweet dream of his mother making him tea, but that returns when in the dream he reaches for her hand and she disappears, and he awakens from that sweetness into the nightmare terror of the voyage. A terror that he also imagines as akin to falling from a tall building, the duration of the fall elongated, drawn out so that in a suspension that approaches stillness, one forgets where one is until contact is made with the land or the boat makes contact again with the sea. In the next frame, we see a woman. She appears to be his mother. And she's sitting in a room with other people, including a young child who sits beside her at what seems to be a wake. We are, it turns out, at Sareen's wake, in the wake of the ship, those ships that keep coming and going, those, quote, wrecked and wretched boats, that pirogue on which he's twice risked his life and then lost it in the hopes of living a better life, in the hopes of having, as he says, quote, more than dust in his pockets, in the hopes of having an answer to hunger and joblessness and the ongoing financialization and immiseration in the face of the after of slavery, of colonialism, of unnatural planned disasters. So Sareen is dead, and yet he's with us still. He sits on the beach, around a fire with his friends. They tell him they'd rather stay in Senegal. They ask him, how did you have the courage to make this trip? And he tries to explain to them why he left. He tries to explain what happens when you make land in Europe, how you may be deported, and how he would and how he did make that trip again. It wasn't courage, he says. It was necessity. But he also says, working for my family gives me courage. And because this project is thinking juxtapositionally, and I'm trying to think a number of things together, that moment in the film reminds me of a moment in the film White Light, Black Rain, when Saku Shimohira, one of the survivors of the US bombing of Nagasaki, who's now an elderly woman, says that her sister committed suicide by throwing herself in front of a speeding train at the age of 14. And that soon after her sister commits suicide, she too goes down to those train tracks and stands there. But as the train approaches, she jumps off the tracks. And she says that she held on to life. And she said that she realizes, quote, that there are two kinds of courage, the courage to live and the courage to die. I chose the courage to live, end quote. And so that there is the courage in the film Atlantique, the courage to stay in Senegal and the courage to leave Senegal, the courage to stay and the courage to get on that ship. Listen to Senegalese novelist Fatou Diom. Those people whose bodies are washing up on these shores, and I carefully choose my words, if they were whites, the whole earth should be shaking now. Instead, it's blacks and Arabs who are dying, and their lives are cheaper. The European Union, with its navy and war fleet, can rescue the migrants in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean Sea if they want to, but they sit and wait until the migrants die. It's as if letting them drown is used as a deterrent to prevent migrants from coming to Europe. But let me tell you something. That doesn't deter anyone, because the individual who is migrating as a survival instinct, who believes that the life they are living isn't worth much, he's not afraid of death, end quote. So Diop's, and Sareen's Atlantique is the Atlantic of those Africans thrown, jumped, dumped overboard in Middle Passage, those who die still trying to cross the Mediterranean, those who are with us still in the time of the wake known as residence time. And in this way, it's quite different from, say, the Atlantic summoned by Alan Sekula and Noel Birch in their 2010 film, The Forgotten Space. And so when we finally see Sareen Sek, we see him on the beach, on the littoral. Serene, who several people tell us died on December 21st, 2008, but whose grave marker says December 23rd, 2008. Serene Sek, who is real and apparition, who appears before and after the journey, before, after, and in the ocean. He sits on the beach around the fire with his friends as they try to express their love for him, and he for them. He asks if he said goodbye before he left, if they said goodbye to each other. He says it's hard to say goodbye. He says it's hard to say goodbye to those who you love, and he speaks of the impossibility of saying that one is leaving to die. One friend says that he wouldn't leave Serene in the ocean, that if he were on the ship with him, he too would die, as friends, as shipmates. Serene says that some on the journey had the power to transform into fish, and he repeats this as if to comfort himself and them, that some people transform into fish and swim the rest of the way. But like those Igbo people in Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust, who we are told summed up with a look all that had happened, would happen, and happened still, and refused it and walked back into the ocean, those who make that journey don't transform into fish and swim to safety. But in this telling and in many tellings of those who survived this journey, there's something else that often emerges. And I think if it's not safety, then it's something like care. And in that care is another kind of wake work. So I imagine Alpha and Serene and their friends in this account recorded in this untitled newspaper of a man swept overboard and rescued, quote, "We couldn't put him in the middle of the boat because the boat was damaged and we were taking on water. If we left him like this, he'd be gone. So we were really careful with him. I like this when people care. It's all we have." And that's an account counter to the violence of abstraction. It's an account and an act of care as shared risk in the wake. And that's it. I'll just show you this. This is a still from Ash's Steve McQueen, and another still, and I can talk about that later.
Close it. I see. Thanks, and I just want to reiterate appreciation to Niall, Heath, Dion, and everybody who made this conference possible. So, on May 11th, 1953, divine violence unsettled the natural weather patterns in the central Texas landscape. Mary Dinkins recalls in detail her father rushing to pick her up from the all-black Moore High School. She remembers hearing on the radio the threat of a massive tornado. When Mary arrived home, her mother gave a cautious, deliberate prophecy to her and her siblings. Quote, "God is fixing to work, so you all be quiet." Late afternoon, the tornado touched down on the site where Jesse Washington had been lynched nearly 4 decades earlier, ravaging buildings and downtown structures to rubble, resulting in the death of over 100 people. Subsequently, a chronicle of the tornado picked up where Mary's mother's prophecy began. The disaster was nothing other than divine. The terrain itself testified. The tornado was said to have revisited the scene of Jesse Washington's subjection, retracing exactly the path his body was dragged through the city center to Bridge Street over the Brazos River during the spectacle racial tear, which W.E.B. Du Bois rendered as the Waco horror in the Crisis newspaper. In this paper, I attend to this oral theological storytelling tradition emergent among Black residents in Waco, Texas in the mid-20th century, which tells of divine violence in retelling the 1916 lynching of Jesse Washington through a tornado disaster in 1953. Considering the storytelling tradition is important for a number of reasons,
As a communal memory, it attests to what Karen Fields has illuminated as the fact that memory succeeds. And as a kind of vernacular theology, it represents an ethical response to loss and ongoing white supremacist terror, which may be situated within other mid-century Black freedom movements. Moreover, the frame of memory broadly parallels studies in religious ethics, which interweave knowledges of racial terror through morally and politically inflected notions of mourning and melancholy, and leverage them to undermine triumphal narratives of modernity and post-racialism. Like these post-romantic ethics, the Waco tradition may be cast as an ethics upending forgetfulness, invoking the way painful histories have the power to petition collective and communal futures. To this extent, despite white supremacy strategies of forgetting and the intractable segregation of memory, there remains the regional possibility for moral and political projects which organize for just communal futures, attending to what has been lost in the region's history of terror. The calls for a monument to Washington, along with the more than 64 others who were lynched in McLennan County on the 100th anniversary last May, could be taken as one fulfillment, however provisional, of this ethics of mourning. Still, if the purchase of certain ethical theories of tragedy is the invocation of Washington and the organization of current moral and political life, the central feature of the story, that is, the tornado, becomes non-essential. The charge of the story is then not exhausted as a tragic memorial that chastens progressive narratives, and it particularly differs, I argue, insofar as memorialization can imply a logic of closure, a finishedness to the past. So while I take the ethical tragedians to render compellingly the moral powers of mourning and melancholy to the ends of a more just world, I would like to consider another dimension which is brought into view by the storytelling tradition, which suggests an ethics that exceeds the invocation of the tragic. This contrast I'm trying to name might be assessed as the difference between mourning what is lost and naming what is there. In trying to think through the ethical significance of retelling the Waco horror, I want to consider how the story names Jesse Washington's movement after death, affirming his ongoing presence beyond spectacle torture in the lynching event, and locating his agency in the divine violence as a resource in the living's refusal of white supremacist arrangements. This naming indicates a co-labor of the living and the dead, as Jesse Washington's hidden perpetuity is unveiled in the telling of the living, who in turn are made visible in the chaotic tracks of the tornado. As such, Christina Sharpe's powerful work on the weather frames the ongoingness of the story as life and death in the wake, which is not assimilated into the progressive or temporal protocols of Jim Crow modernity. How do we memorialize, Sharpe asks, an event that is still ongoing? Troubling the structural segmentation of quote, monumental time, or a time after tragedy, the Waco story names Washington in the tornado. I want to provide a few comments at the outset about the cultural logic of the local racial order against which the storytelling tradition critically intervenes, which pivots on a spatial and temporal coherence. The coherence I want to attend to begins with the early 20th century historical self-narration of Wacoans, the 8th largest urban area in Texas at the time, which was described as, quote, the Wonder City, hailed for its progressiveness, especially in terms of neo-plantation cotton culture. Black residents in Waco tell this history otherwise as a time of negotiating the transition from slave law to what Ida B. Wells Barnett calls lynch law. Waco and Lester Gibson provides the critical coordinates of the lynch law background in the tornado story, naming the recreational patterns of state-sponsored and extra-legal racial terror. I quote, not only Jesse Washington, I heard of a whole lot of lynchings that were undocumented. It was a recreational thing for the white community to come over, remove African Americans from their community and lynch them right there where the bridge is. And they call that the bridge of understanding. You stay on that side, we stay on this side of the road. But recreational, as we call it, recreational lynching was very common in McLennan County. The route that Jesse Washington was dragged down Austin Street, the tornado took the same route. Gibson's narrative of the local racial regime indicates how racial terror spatializes physical geographies, which are not simply the secure background of social life, but are networked to and produced by uncertainties of environmental interaction. White social life is naturalized as central and mobile on the near side of the bridge of understanding, while black social life is naturalized as the ungeographic, displaced and enclosed in the, quote, no man's land on the other side of the bridge. It is against this background that the tornado of 1953 intervenes. Waco and Michael Bayers testifies to its significance. Quote, black Wacoans felt that God got their back. God got Waco back because the lynching was the same route that the tornado of 53 took. They felt vindicated. More directly, Maggie Washington summarizes the merging of these events, saying, quote, the tornado relived or retold the story of that lynching. She further elaborates the tornado's intentional movement. Quote, it just flattened Bridge Street. And Bridge Street was where the white mob stopped to show blacks that they had dragged him. They dragged him through the streets from downtown, stopped on Bridge Street to be sure that they would see him, and then went out onto Elm Street and turned left on Garrison and came back. And that's the route the tornado took. Although separated by nearly 4 decades, the scene of subjection and the route of the tornado disaster are spatially identified. What made the interlacing of these stories together possible? At one level, a network between the very ground on which Jesse Washington was dragged and the tornado touched down. A link which disregarded temporal distance between these disasters. Time, or a conception of linear or calendric or sequestered or, quote, monumental time, is suspended or rendered inconsequential in the wake of this spatial identification. As Christina Sharpe foregrounds in her reading of Beloved, quote, time doesn't matter. So the temporal difference between 1960 and 1953 does not matter. What makes temporal disregard central to the movement of the storytelling tradition is that what happened in 1916, 1953 happened on the same grounds. To advance this reading of the untimely spatial identification about the same grounds is not to say that these events did not happen on demonic grounds, to borrow Kath McKittrick's concept for the instability and uncertainty in geographic knowledge production. Rather, and to shift to Sharpe's climatological language, it is to say that the ground is recognizably the same because it is conditioned by the same weather patterns. As Sharpe writes, quote, in what I'm calling the weather, anti-blackness is pervasive as climate. Continuity of the weather in the sense of ongoing disaster after slavery procures the integration of the 1916-1953 disasters. Still, in the weather, as Sharpe writes, quote, there is disaster and possibility. The Waco storytelling tradition performs possibility in disaster by taking what would otherwise be rendered as a natural disaster and producing a new ecology. It is an ethics of divine violence, or a naming of Jesse Washington in the whirlwind, which I'm trying to consider as such an ecology. That Washington can be named in the tornado story entails not only an early to mid-century continuity in the weather and racial order in Central Texas, it additionally entails a sense of Jesse Washington's perpetuity, his ongoing presence in the landscape after his spectacle lynching. This is to say, what enables the naming of his apocalyptic movement in the tornado is his enduring presence. Drawing on Waco and Lester Gibson's critical language, he's, quote, not going to go away. To invoke the category of divine violence as a gloss on the tornado in the tradition of Walter Benjamin's use of the term is to characterize a radical interruption in the ordinary cycles of mythic violence. Quote, this is Benjamin, if mythical violence is lawmaking, divine violence is law destroying. If the former sets boundaries, the latter boundlessly destroys. Under the arrangements of lynch law, the chaos of the tornado as divine violence is then how justice manifests itself. Accordingly, this violence is not simply the negation of another event or world, rather it is the discernment of an already negated world, which is to say an understanding that the lynching of Jesse Washington already constituted a world of everyday disaster. This account of divine violence provides a strong sense of critique within and against the racial order, but insofar as it relies on an interpretive model of instantaneous or lightning flash or momentary interruption, it does not adequately name the perpetuity of Jesse Washington in the Waco storytelling tradition. In order to address this aspect of the story, Benjamin's concept might be supplemented by Cedric Robinson's notion of divine agency. In the Anthropology of Marxism, as Avery Gordon elaborates it, Robinson's image of divine agents has to do with, quote, the recovery of human life from the spoilage of degradation, characterizes the human capacity to expose contingency and unmake the terms of order. Like Robinson's notion, I here mean to suggest that the eruptive dimension of divine violence must be peopled and located within traditions and ecologies which work to undo the terms of racial order. What the Waco storytelling tradition distinctively adds to this is not only the peopling insight, which attaches divine violence to the labors of the living, say in practices which remember the needy dead or in eruptive protest movements, but that this dynamism might also be discerned in the movement of the dead after death, reframing divine violence as the labors of the dead for the living. To name Jesse Washington's perpetuity in the tornado means to see him beyond the terror of his premature death, presently moving in the landscape and in the disaster that upset the regional racial regime. What Washington effectively performs in this act of divine violence is then not a recollection of his own death or repetition of the terror of premature death. A recollection of his own life or repetition of his own death. Rather, on this reading, his naming in the tornado marks an ethical refusal of the persistent disaster of the racial order. It is at this juncture where the storytelling tradition parts ways with ethical theories of the tragic. The presence of Washington, or the naming of his presence, I understand, separates the storytelling tradition from the ethics of tragedy because the latter is tempted to closure in its tragic evocations, which is to say, the writing of tragedy is pressured to sequester the past from the present according to a linear structure of monumental time. What, after all, does the tragic refer to in the Waco horror? Surely Jesse Washington, the loss of his singular person, perhaps the 64 and more other local lynching sufferers for whom his name has become a proxy. Or still the fact that racial terrorism happened and the enduring white supremacist conditions which enabled it, as well as the white terrorists who walked free, another, quote, lynching at the hands of persons unknown, as well as the collusion of local authorities in the making of lynch law sovereignty. As the litany grows and tragedy is projected into the future, a better question may be what is not tragic and what should not be mourned. In the wake of enormity, what I take to be significant about this storytelling tradition is that it does not resolve as a memorial to Washington, but nor then does it take leave of moral concern altogether. The collaborative fruit of the storytelling tradition is that it names what otherwise remains hidden in the chaos of the tornado, namely Jesse Washington's ongoing movement. In this naming is a picture of the dead and living working together, integrating past and present disasters, and initiating a kind of ethical imagining that makes visible Black life and death.
So as I pull up the PowerPoint, I want to echo everyone's thank you to Heath and Niall for having us here, and to all of you for being here, and to Professor Benjamin for an amazing keynote that set the tone for all of this so beautifully yesterday. All right, so. And for your computer, Professor Benjamin. Okay. So my presentation, We Still Charge Genocide, the history of claiming and conceptualizing genocide in African American newspapers, actually comes out of the first chapter of my dissertation. So because of that, I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of the first chapter to give you all the context and background for understanding where this paper comes from and to highlight the stakes and broader scope of the talk. So one of my primary general research interests is examining the intersections of African American studies, African American literature, and genocide studies. And my dissertation in particular is a literary history of how the term genocide has been deployed in relation to Black communities across the globe in post-Holocaust era writing. And so the first chapter examines the use and coverage of the word genocide in 8 African American newspapers in the post-World War II period. So these are the newspapers that the chapter covers, and these are also the newspapers I'm referring to here. So when I say the Black press or African American newspapers in this talk, this is the group that I'm talking about. And just for some background on the word genocide itself, so everyone's on the same page about what definition I'm using, I'm working with the official United Nations definition. So on December 9th, 1948, the United Nations defined genocide for the first time and adopted the Genocide Convention. The convention defines genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And this is the full definition, and you can see which acts are considered qualifying as genocide, which is actually a broader list than most people think. So through an analysis of the Black press's engagement with the term genocide, my first chapter presents a twofold argument. On one level, it argues that Black newspapers are one of the primary public spheres in which we see discussions play out about the meaning and importance of the concept of genocide for Black Americans, and that it is within this sphere that we witness the reconceptualization of Black suffering through the lens of genocide. The chapter also argues that the Black press's continued attempts to classify Black suffering as genocide represent a deliberate emancipatory effort to remold the concept of genocide itself. So even after it became clear that the term genocide was primarily being applied to the 1915 Armenian massacres, which were later renamed the Armenian Genocide, and the Holocaust, the Black press continued to push for a verdict of genocide against Black Americans, therefore implicitly insisting upon the possible inclusive power of the term and trying to push it beyond its Eurocentric application and into fulfilling its protective potential to offer tangible relief to all persecuted populations. So this paper, what I'm about to give, is a snapshot of the larger chapter. It provides a glimpse into all of these aforementioned arguments, and it also argues, within the context of this conference, that examining this underemphasized history illustrates that contemporary Black claims of genocide are neither new nor groundless, despite being depicted often as both, but rather part of a sustained, rich tradition of Black liberation that was urgently and consciously reconceptualized through the lens of genocide in the post-World War II era, and continues to be reshaped today. And before continuing, I just want to note that it's imperative to note that although critics have turned almost every comparison African Americans have drawn between their suffering and the Holocaust into negative ones that are drenched in competition, the Black press and the other authors mentioned here, including the Civil Rights Congress, who I'll discuss in depth, made it clear repeatedly that they stood in solidarity with the Jewish victims of the Holocaust. Almost every time they bring up the Holocaust, there is an extensive expression of solidarity. I had to cut a lot of that out for this, but I just want to keep that solidarity in mind as we move through a lot of these quotes, because the competitive aspect is it's not the move the Black press is making, it's not the move I'm making, and yet it's usually the first place people go in their minds. I just want to put that out there. So moving into the body of the paper. Lila Bella Carter was 16 years old when she was raped and murdered in South Carolina in 1945. When her body was found, her neck and jaw were broken, and she had been placed face down in a pool of water to stage a drowning. The evidence indicated that a white insurance agent was responsible for the crime. However, when Lila's father went to the police, he was the one who was forced into jail for reporting the crime. There were no witnesses or documentation. The perpetrator was never held accountable, and another Black child's murder was forced into the vacuum of historical erasure. Almost 70 years later, many of us watched and circulated the murder of Eric Garner on our phone and computer screens. Over and over, we watched him beg for breath. Over and over, we watched him die. When his death was ruled a homicide, and yet the police officers responsible were not charged, thereby adding Garner's name to the seemingly endless list of Black Americans who received not even posthumous justice, many wondered about the purpose of watching Black death on camera. If Garner's videotaped murder was doomed to the same lack of justice as Lila Carter's and all those before and after her, then why were we circulating violent footage of his last moments? In 2015, Stephen W. Thrasher coined the phrase, "the pornography of Black America's genocide," to describe the perversity of watching African Americans being murdered on repeat. While the phrase was discussed in many Black media outlets, the main focus was on the use of the word pornography, which meant that the significance of naming and claiming the violence as genocide was not discussed in depth, despite how necessary it is for us to analyze that significance and delve into the history of that naming. The Black press's relationship with the word genocide is complex and has gone through many changes, but I have divided it into what I identify as two main phases. As history is never clean, the phases bleed into each other, but I still find it helpful to separate them by their central concepts. In what I identify as phase one, which stretched from approximately 1945 to 1955, the reports and articles focus primarily on explaining the emergence of the term genocide and the author's hopes that the term would outlaw lynching. This phase also included coverage of the Civil Rights Congress, also called the CRC's, 1951 petition, We Charge Genocide, the Crime of Government Against the Negro People, which asked the United Nations to charge the United States with genocide against Black Americans under the 1948 Convention, and which is where Lila Carter's murder was originally recorded. And her murder was one of hundreds, literally, that are listed in the petition. So I just put together some others from those pages so you can see the ways that they were listing the victims of white supremacist violence. The second phase began around 1955 and merged discussions of genocide with the civil rights movement. Rather than honing in on lynching, this phase depicted the various elements of Black oppression highlighted in the civil rights movement, such as segregation, unequal access to health care, failing infrastructure, etc., as parts of a multifaceted, expansive genocidal system. The Black press's move from phase 1 to phase 2 provides insight into the newspaper's consistently evolving conceptualization of genocide and reveals how they tried to give the word an inclusive power of protection that extended beyond the typical Eurocentric usage of the term during these decades. So for some examples and details about what I'm calling phase 1. In what appears to be the earliest mention of the word genocide in the Black press, the Norfolk Journal and Guide published an article in March of 1946 entitled, "Here's a New Word for Your Vocabulary, Genocide," with an exclamation point, so I said it like that. The article noted that the word would, quote, "outlaw attacks on races if successful." So here are just 4 articles that I pulled from the archives that show the introduction of this word. In another early article on the term, in August of 1947, the New York Amsterdam News published an article arguing that, quote, "the government of the United States is today guilty of race murder as brutal as any staged by Hitler. This guilt is written in the blood of the lynched victims of the South and in the blood of the Jews." So the article also indicts the United States and several European nations with crimes of empire abroad, which is something that we can talk about because these articles also do continually link American genocide abroad with the domestic genocide against Black Americans, but it places significant emphasis on US lynching as genocide. And while the equation of the United States government with Hitler might not seem shocking today, or at least maybe not in this circle, in 1947, it was significant to explicitly indict the United States with the same crimes as Nazi Germany. And after this article, it became pretty much very common practice for Black press articles about genocide to conceptualize of the violence of lynching as genocidal and within the discussions of the Holocaust. In October of 1947, the Chicago Defender published an article entitled "Much Needed New Word," which is up there on the right, which was one of the first articles to assert that, quote, "this new interpretation of international law," which is the Genocide Convention, "might give America the much-needed weapon with which to combat the evil of lynching. For certainly, lynching comes within the context of genocide." And these are just a couple articles, which are part of countless articles that were discussing the emergence of the convention and the hopes that it would outlaw lynching. And the last article is basically eviscerating the United States for their failure to ratify the convention, and we'll talk about that. The most explicit and extensive condemnation of the United States government's treatment of African Americans came in the form of the CRC's 1951 petition, We Charge Genocide. The 200-plus page document lists various ways the United States is guilty of genocide against Black Americans, ranging from lynching to segregation to unequal access to health care to everything in between. But the primary focus, if you had to pick one, is on lynching. Although the petition was released only 3 years after the meeting of the Genocide Convention, and therefore its authors were not aware of what would become the impotency of the convention, the petition can still be read as both an attempt to reconceptualize Black suffering as genocide, and through that reconceptualization and the implicit belief that a verdict of Black genocide would simultaneously render the United States a violator of international law and provide relief for Black Americans, it can also be read as one of the earliest displays of belief in the inclusive potential of the convention. The petition's overarching argument is found in one section of its introduction. So this is a larger excerpt than what I'm going to read, just to give you all some context. But the most important quote, if I had to choose one from the introduction, is, "It is sometimes incorrectly thought that genocide means the complete and definitive destruction of a race or people. The Genocide Convention, however, defines genocide as any killings on the basis of race, or, in its specific words, as killing members of the group. Any intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, racial, ethnic, or religious group is genocide, according to the convention." So as the petition's introduction notes, it is generally thought that for an event to qualify as genocide, the entirety of a group of people, or at least the significant majority, must be annihilated. and/or there must be a plan, a visible plan for such total annihilation. This misinformed definition is so widespread that it is one of the most commonly used counterarguments to Black American claims of genocide. The persecution faced by Black Americans cannot be genocide, the argument goes, because there was or is no evidence of a collective plan to murder all Black Americans. And this counterargument is usually brought up in juxtaposition with Hitler's final solution, which every time the CRC brought up, they denounced vehemently again and expressed solidarity with the Jewish victims. The authors of the CRC petition, however, were particularly astute readers and honed in on the or in part portion of the definition, taking exquisite care throughout the petition to highlight how United States policies clearly and intentionally eliminated, at minimum, portions of the African American population, which is all that was needed for a verdict of genocide. In December of 1951 and January of 1952, the United States revoked passports of members of the CRC. The Afro-American, the Amsterdam News, and the Philadelphia Tribune responded by publishing multiple articles supporting and summarizing the petition, honing in on its use of in part to support a verdict of genocide against African Americans, highlighting the multiple ways the petition points out that lynching undeniably violated the convention, criticizing the government's actions against the CRC, and urging the United States to restore the leaders' passports. So here are some of the articles that are discussing everything happening around the CRC petition on this slide as well. The Atlanta Daily World followed the trends of its peer papers, but it also provided a series of articles that produced some of the most important evidence we have to date about the US's attempts to ensure that lynching would not qualify as genocide by pushing for removal of the in part portion of the definition. Although the Atlanta Daily World was one of the first to cover these attempts at modification of the convention, their articles represent the beginning of a trend in which the Black press explained how the petition's merit was essentially proven by the United States' refusal to ratify, due to its fear of being charged with genocide against African Americans. And just for context, the United States did not ratify the Genocide Convention until 1988. The first 40 countries ratified by 1953, and most of the others had definitely ratified before 1988. So moving into phase 2 and some details and examples from the second phase, or what I'm calling phase 2. The CRC petition was dismissed by the UN. It was buried by the mainstream media, with the exception of some articles calling it communist propaganda, because this was all happening in the midst of the Cold War, and that played a huge role in the petition being dismissed. Nonetheless, the Black press continued covering the petition until approximately 1955, when coverage was largely replaced by coverage of the civil rights movement. During these decades, the Black press produced articles describing mass incarceration, substandard living and healthcare conditions, targeted abortions, psychological abuse, the murders of Black Panthers, the Tuskegee experiment and other medical experimentation, police brutality, and more as instruments of genocide. So here you can see some of the new ways that they're conceiving of genocide in this time period. And this slide as well. Although one could glance at these seemingly disconnected topics and think that this phase represented the dissolution of the Black press's cohesive attempts to talk about genocide, the abundance of topics, when taken together, reveal not chaotic fragmentation, but a fundamental shift in how the Black press was conceiving of genocide, as it began viewing it as occurring from multiple angles that worked together to form a comprehensive plan of genocide against Black Americans. The articles produced in these decades also shifted the very manner in which genocide was discussed. In phase 1, the Black press had not only focused primarily on lynching as the main example of genocide against Black Americans, but the newspapers also focused on these murders as events. Lynching was described in shocking terms that highlighted the outrageousness of the incidents, often in a manner similar to how the gas chambers were described after the Holocaust. The gas chambers were one of the most discussed elements of the genocide of the European Jews, even though countless Jews also perished from starvation and disease in the constructed ghettos of Nazi Germany. Narratives about the gas chambers, however, remained dominant. It attracted more attention to discuss furnaces and death camps constructed solely for the purpose of mass murder than to discuss Jews slowly starving to death or dying of dehydration in the ghettos. Lynching was highlighted in the Black press's earlier discussions of genocide in a similar way. Even though countless Black Americans were dying of a combination of poverty and lack of access to sufficient hospitals, discussions of hanging and burning Black Americans alive elicited more fervent claims of genocide. But as the civil rights movement produced extended analysis of the multiple areas of attack Black Americans were being subjected to, the Black press recognized that these daily systemic issues were just as necessary to discuss through the lens of genocide, and therefore produced articles highlighting the ways that genocide does not occur solely through dramatically violent, shocking events, but also through a series of unrelenting daily conditions that make survival difficult at best and often impossible. So in one article that exemplifies the trends particularly well of this phase, in 1970, the Norfolk Journal and Guide published an article in which Angela Davis spoke out from prison and stated that, quote, "Our enemies find themselves confronted with a growing awareness among the people that the concentrated effort to maim and murder revolutionaries is just another form of the daily genocide of police brutality and impoverished living conditions in the ghettos and barrios." So this quote reflects one of the main conceptual shifts in the Black press's discussion of genocide in this time period, the shift to conceiving of genocide as quotidian systems that combine to devastate in ways which, over time, match or even exceed the destruction of bursts of more sensationalist violence. Davis makes it clear that police brutality and impoverished living conditions are equal agents of genocide. Her statement about the murder of revolutionaries is a reference to the murders of Black Panthers, which were another significant topic in the Black press at this time, as you can see one of the articles up there. However, unlike some or even many articles during this phase, Davis does not privilege the murder of the Black Panthers as a more significant form of genocide than the constructed poverty of the ghettos or the proliferation of other police murders. Her point is precisely that all of these factors are equal contributors to the comprehensive system of genocide against Black Americans. So this trend of discussing genocide in this multifaceted manner continued through the 1980s. The word was used here and there between the late 1980s and 2012, but not in as extended, ubiquitous conversation as during the prior decades. Then it reappeared in a more consistent fashion in 2012 following the murder of Trayvon Martin, and it has continued to appear more frequently on contemporary media sites and in public conversations about the current situation of Black Americans, particularly since Thrasher's introduction of the phrase, "the pornography of our genocide." As we consider how to approach these conversations, it is worth analyzing the nuances of this history. Although the Black press's inability to secure a verdict of genocide within the Eurocentric post-war arena is important to discuss, so too is the determination of the Black press to continue pushing for that verdict, a move that I read as a pointed form of resistance. While some might dismiss this as placing futile hope in a convention that had failed them, I argue that the continued shifting attempts by the Black press to classify Black suffering as genocide reveal not a desperate clinging to a word that had proven ineffective in protecting them, but a concerted, diligent effort to reconceptualize the convention and the word into something that was an effective form of protection. As we move into yet another era of fighting for justice for Black populations, as the terror around and against us rages on, it is heartening to consider that the resurgence of the use of the word genocide in Black American 21st century movements reflects the imprint the Black press's articles and efforts made, even if we were not aware of just how deep their impact ran. From the youth group in Chicago called We Charge Genocide that is dedicated to fighting police brutality, to those fighting for clean water in Black communities, to countless other organizations and individuals invoking this history in various ways, our ancestors campaigned to name our suffering as genocide, to claim it as something that deserved to be rendered illegal, has persisted. Approximately 70 years after the Black press published its first articles declaring the emergence of a word, a new word, they hoped would protect and liberate us all, we still charge genocide, and we still work tirelessly towards the day when that charge is no longer needed. Thank you.
I pull this up, I'll just say thank you all again for coming today. We're all honored to be here. And I'll just say that this presentation is a small selection from my broader project, which looks at the history of Black political mourning in the United States across the first half of the 20th century, and ends with the discussion of Emmett Till's funeral, which I'll be sharing with you today. The title of my presentation is They Came to See Him, Emmett Till's Funeral and the Making of Race. Other words which could have been substituted for making include the remaking or unmaking of race, or the politicization of race. I will return to this image later. It's a screenshot from Stanley Nelson's 2003 documentary, The Murder of Emmett Till. And I'll also just note that I'll be skipping some contextual details for the sake of time, but I'd be happy to elaborate in the Q&A. Mamie Bradley, the mother of Emmett Lewis Till, a black boy from Chicago who was mutilated and lynched in Mississippi in 1955, worked tirelessly to present her son's corpse to the broader public in order to showcase racism's enduring and extensive consequences. Bradley demanded that Till be given an open casket funeral, which lasted 4 days. Hundreds of thousands of mostly black witnesses passed by Till's casket in Chicago. Many more would view images of his ravaged remains when they later appeared in black periodicals, such as Jet and the Chicago Defender. Bradley thus mobilized a politics of black mourning that was unprecedented for its scale and scope. Within a space of mourning, black people in the United States came to feel, often for the first time, especially children, a sense of their own vulnerability and endangerment, one articulated by activists and parents alike as a collective attribute of black belonging. This experience spurred many of them to work toward rectifying the conditions that reproduced racial disparity and anti-black animosity. Scholars have drawn proper attention to the way in which Bradley and other organizers utilized photography and the black press to mobilize for anti-racist political purposes. The spectacle of Till's mangled body and Bradley's anguish. Relatively little, however, has been written about the collective experience shared by the scores of black people who mourned Till together over the course of multiple days in Chicago. This paper thus focuses on how the wake, viewing, and burial of Emmett Till worked to produce, expand, and politicize conceptions of race and community in the mid-century United States. Of course, people across the nation would mourn Till privately in their own ways, but such affairs did not attract the numbers that attended Till's funeral in Chicago, an event that also included the wrenching presence of Till's body and Mamie Bradley. As an intentionally subversive mass public exploit, the wake, funeral, extended viewing, and burial of Emmett Till concentrated the despair of hundreds of thousands of black Americans into a collective utterance that was pivotal for its magnitude and spectacularity and its concomitant impact on an emerging generation of activism. On September 2nd, 1955, the day of her son's open casket wake, Bradley declined funeral director A.A. Rayner's offer to retouch the corpse, although Rayner did do some small modifications which Bradley later appreciated. But she explained that she needed the world to see what had happened to her boy in the way she had in her own private viewing of the corpse. She knew she could never convey through words what she had witnessed. As Bradley states in her memoir, "I knew that if they walked by that casket, if people opened the pages of Jet magazine and the Chicago Defender, if other people could see it with their own eyes, then together we might find a way to express what we had seen. It was important to do that, I thought, to help people recognize the horrible problems we were facing in the South." Bradley here points to her own effort to produce language, a means of collective expression, through the image of her son. Bradley, in other words, aimed to stimulate through the visual register a language of loss, as literary scholar David Eng has phrased it, against a loss of language regarding the persistence of anti-black hostility in the United States. A loss that stemmed both from Bradley's own inability to describe adequately the state of her son's corpse, as well as an officially sanctioned effort to eradicate, or in Till's case, literally bury evidence of lynching in the South. Till's corpse was almost buried in Mississippi without his mother's knowledge. Bradley needed people to see Till for themselves so that, in her words, if we got a chance to talk about it, they would know what she was talking about. As she explained in a 1991 interview, Bradley hoped others would help her tell the story. The Till story was thus intended to be, and certainly became, a collective narrative woven through the testimonies of countless witnesses to his grotesque remains. Scholars have long praised Bradley's courage in deciding to hold an open casket funeral. Yet Bradley herself describes the decision as something she simply had to do, because she could not describe the condition of Till's body. In fact, Bradley claims in her memoir that she is not sure what motivated her actions in this trying period. She felt compelled by something, some force that moved and worked through her. Undoubtedly, Bradley's demand for an open casket funeral was brave and explicitly political, but it was also spiritual in this way. Just 2 days earlier, after all, Bradley had spoken directly with the divine presence that had directed her to be a vessel, a spiritual messenger like St. Paul, spreading the word of her son's sacrifice. Retrieved from the Tallahatchie River 3 days after his murder, Till had been resurrected in a Christ-like way. It was now Bradley's job to facilitate the salvation of the nation, that her son's death had been ordained to effect. She sought to do this through the mass display of his and her own body. Here's a shot of the crowd outside of Robert's Temple, where Till's body was on display. Total crowd estimates range from 1 to 600,000 people viewed his body over the course of 4 days. Like other practitioners of political mourning, Bradley knew that a sense of collective responsibility, even among Black people, could not be taken for granted. It had to be produced. Black Southerners, for instance, had reportedly suggested among each other that Till deserved his fate. According to Curtis Rivers, who was a young Black man in Nashville, Tennessee in 1955, many Black people he knew at the time considered Till blameworthy for not knowing how to act around white people. From the perspective of these people, Till was trying, as Curtis remembers, to act all mannish in his brass flirtation with a white woman, and so his death was more his fault than it was anything else. Such comments were probably part of a larger effort to warn Black children in the South against interacting with white women, but they also point to a general lack of intra-racial empathy that Bradley wanted to generate. Bradley herself stated that she had not been concerned with the tribulations of Black people in the South until her own son died. His death, as she explained to a large audience in Cleveland's Antioch Baptist Church on September 18, 1955, finally showed her that, in her words, what happened to any of us, anywhere in the world, had better be the business of all of us. Bradley sought to cultivate a sense of collective responsibility by goading Black people in huge numbers into experiencing in common a feeling of vulnerability that was framed as a collective attribute that united them as Black people. Ideally, this would then propel many to challenge the circumstances producing Black endangerment. A mourning event like Till's funeral, along with the explication of his death found in the press coverage, speeches, and sermons that accompanied it, provided a rich opportunity for such a transformational experience to take place. Journalist Robert Elliott in the Chicago Defender detailed the process by which funeral goers came to claim Till as one of their own. As Elliott explained, they saw his ravaged face and grew irate. They considered Till's alleged crime, whistling at a white woman, to be something their own children might do. And thinking that, they suddenly felt Emmett Till belonged to them, and they came to see him. That's a quote from Elliott. Many people spoke to Till, and they all vowed never to forget him. What Elliott describes here is a process of reorientation, in which a large number of people came to feel implicated in the life and death of a boy they never knew, and thus, by extension, the fates of others of their race for whom they had previously felt relatively little concern. Indeed, as Elliott suggests, members of the crowd incorporated Till into their lives, not because he was a Black boy per se, but rather because the funeral context encouraged them to feel angry and vulnerable as parents of children who might have suffered a similarly atrocious demise. This feeling compelled them to view Till in a newly intimate way. In this regard, Elliott's declaration that they came to see him takes on a more profound meaning than its literal significance, as in they arrived there to see the remains, and also they came to recognize Emmett as something more intimate, as one of their own. Here's the screenshot again from Stanley Nelson's film. And I have many pictures, I just picked a few. You can see on the faces of these people waiting their turn to view Emmett Till expressions of concern and horror. But I'll also point out that there appears to be a white woman in the background of the image. I'm not sure that she is white, but it is worth noting that white people did attend the funeral and the burial, and they were welcomed into that space. Their numbers were not large, there were very few of them, but they were there. And this is in part because Mamie Bradley viewed her son's death as a tragedy for everyone. He was a tragedy for the nation to mourn. She felt like, as she said, the whole nation is mourning with her, and the whole nation had to bear witness to this. And as she described Emmett Till, he was a universal child whose death had been ordained by God to save us all, which by necessity also included white people. Till's funeral festival worked to generate, expand, reinforce, and politicize the Black community in the mid-century United States. Arthur Miller, who attended school with Till at McGosh Elementary, delineates the construction of this community in his memoir. As Miller states, Till's death forced people to recognize that racism afflicted Black people in the North as much as those in the South. He recounts how adults in the area came together to collect money to help bury Till, and met to discuss ways to respond to the tragedy and to appeal to the government. Almost every adult in the neighborhood and many of Miller's friends attended the funeral. Upon returning from it, Miller's mother and sister were curiously silent. Miller recalls that their eyes were red, swollen, and empty. They sat on the living room couch, and his sister placed her head on his mother's shoulder. To Miller, it, in his words, appeared as if they couldn't, or maybe wouldn't, separate themselves from one another. It was as if they drew strength and courage from their collective grief. As Miller's recollection illustrates, Black parents and children literally and metaphorically held on to each other with a greater sense of urgency following their confrontation with Till's remains and the fragility of Black life they represented. In so doing, they found a source not only of solace and fortitude, but also knowledge, what historian Jonathan Holloway has referred to as Jim Crow wisdom. As mortician Harry Case points out, many parents brought their children with them to the funeral because they wanted to instill in them an appreciation for the indescribable danger that imperiled their lives. 11-year-old Maria K. Mutri, for instance, who had just moved to Chicago from Nashville, Tennessee, stood in line with her parents for hours to view Till. The immensity of the crowd stunned her. She was amazed that so many people had been brought together by the death of a child. Till's murder, the showcasing of his body, the acquittal of his killers, and the persistent inaction on the part of the federal government to respond to this and other lynchings fundamentally transformed the way Black Americans of that generation especially viewed themselves in relation to other Black people, to white people, and to the American polity at large. The politicization of Till's lynching helped to fuel a growing conviction among Black people to organize in defense of their bodies. As activist and politician Reverend Jesse Jackson has explained, the Supreme Court's Brown decision in 1954 legally outlawed Jim Crow segregation, but changed little in the daily lives of Black people. It was the Till lynching that was, in Jackson's words, the gigantic earthquake that shook us and transformed our consciousness. Black press coverage of the funeral, the biggest single civil rights demonstration of its time, broke records, resulting in the largest number of editions sold of Jet magazine and the Chicago Defender. The membership of organizations like the NAACP and the National Urban League mushroomed, and new ones formed. As Arthur Miller states, Black people, in his words, began to awaken and respond to the national disgrace of their own brutalization. A collective resolve began to emerge. It was time to take a stand. Author John Weidman found that the deaths of Till and other Black children during the years of the Civil Rights Movement worked to solidify Black people politically. As Weidman asserts, grief was collective, began to unify us, clarify our thinking, roll back the rock of our fear. Because grief operated through a nebulous register of emotion, it could reach and affect large numbers of people in ways disallowed by other modes of politics. The co-author of Bradley's memoir, Christopher Benson, has pointed out that Bradley understood the power inherent in the simplicity of the narrative of her son's death. Till had been the innocent young victim of a vicious, racist killing, and his murderers had not been punished. This story ignited people in a way the Brown decision never could. As Jesse Jackson has indicated, it indelibly altered the very bodies and psyches of Black Americans. As he states, it touched our bone marrow, the DNA of our dignity. Such bodily transformations took place within and through the onslaught of mass mourning that Till's funeral occasioned. Consider in closing Bishop Lewis Henry Ford's recollection of Till's burial, which speaks to the politicizing experience of attending this particular event and the funeral in general. Indeed, at the burial, as in the mourning events of the previous days, participants like Ford, who gave Till's eulogy in Chicago, came to discern the jeopardy of their own racial belonging in a profoundly salient, corporeal way that would impel many into political action. As Ford recalls, when they were lowering the remains of the body at Burr Oak Cemetery in the grave, and when that mother fell in my arms and screamed and said, "Oh God, why?" It seemed that a nerve ran all over me, and until this day I felt the effects of it. To look in the face of an innocent boy, and that was the beginning, I feel, of America really becoming aware of the viciousness of racism. Ford's experience of the burial is visual, tactile, and auditory. He sees Till's body disappear into the earth, feels Bradley collapse into his arms, and hears her cry to God. It is a bodily, multisensory experience that leaves his own body permanently affected. Indeed, it generates in him a kind of embodied memory, a nerve that reverberates through him. By way of this sensation, Ford is returned to Emmett Till, his mother, and the others with whom he mourned that day at Burr Oak Cemetery. His very body, like that of Reverend Jesse Jackson and innumerable others, has become immutably linked to them across space and time. Moreover, as Bradley intended, this feeling of connection was not only produced, but also politicized during Till's viewing and burial, and that it was grounded in a feeling of vulnerability that was articulated as a common experience of Black people in America, even innocent children. Many people, especially young Black people, would thus come to view their own Blackness as a mark of endangerment and, like Ford, viscerally sense the precariousness of their bodies. Many of these people would thereby be galvanized into participating in the Black freedom struggle. Therefore, it was not yet America in general, as Ford claims, that became aware of the country's racism. First, Black people had to experience among themselves the kind of transformational affliction that Ford endured at Till's burial. They had to feel deep within their bones that their lives and livelihoods were intertwined and collectively threatened. Only then could they work to disrupt, awaken, and remake the nation. Thank you.
Hey there. Dude, did I just like break stuff? Okay. Yeah. All right. I also want to thank the organizers for the conference itself and putting on this session, and certainly asking me to be a discussant. These papers, I will say that I did not have the chance to read Professor Sharpe's paper beforehand, which I regret because that was a fantastic presentation. But the papers that I did read were outstanding. And so I'm very, very grateful to have the opportunity to speak about them. I'm going to make relatively brief comments. I mean, not super brief, but relatively brief, in hopes of not sort of obstructing the space for a discussion, because I think that they've raised a lot of provocative points and lots of space for discussion, but also debate, and what this, how these things relate to each other, but also perhaps how they relate to the contemporary moment that we're in. So I will make my remarks, and then we'll see if the panelists actually want to speak to each other, respond to each other, and then open things up to a broader discussion. To wake is to emerge from a state of sleep, or to cause something or someone to stir or come to life. Awake is a vigil beside the body of someone who has died. These papers respond to issues of death, resistance, mourning, and recurrence. In doing so, they speak to the temporal and spatial dimensions of Black protest. They do so as an expression of what Tyler Davis describes as the co-labor of the living and the dead. It is the cycle of living and dying and the relationship between the two that is not just an act of nature, but is also an act of politics. These reflections are important not only because they help us make sense of the past and a history of Black resistance, but they also help us interpret our contemporary moment of Black Lives Matter. In effect, these papers demonstrate, quote, Black Lives Matter as a political imperative in Black protest as a 20th century phenomenon, as much as it is a slogan that captures the elemental despair and defiance of Black life today. In Emmanuela Kucik's paper, We Still Charge Genocide, she is looking at the ways that the Black press has used the term genocide in two phases to describe the premature death of Black people. In the earlier phase, Genocide was deployed in connection to the Nazi Holocaust to draw connections between the mass murder of Jews and the mass violence and oppression that pervaded all of Black life. Kucik makes a powerful argument that links the debates over the term to activist campaigns spanning the immediate aftermath of the post-war era into the Black insurgency of the late 1960s. She does this by describing Black media efforts as reconceptualization of the term genocide. But I wonder if the first iteration of its use in the first phase, in the immediate post-war period, is not necessarily reconceptualization, but is perhaps intended to draw real, not metaphorical or even analogous connections to the term. It was in the aftermath of the discovery of the Nazi regime's use of race and the fake science derived from the man-made concept that the world came to know the meaning of racism, a word or concept that immediately made sense of the lives of Black people. It was not a leap to make the connection between the uses of racial pseudoscience to condemn an entire people to death in one context that could easily be made to fit an American context. But perhaps most importantly, using the term genocide helped to bring attention to the state-sanctioned aspect of the violence perpetrated against African Americans. While the We Charge Genocide petition was intended to bring attention to the phenomenon of extra-legal attacks on African Americans, primarily in the role of lynchings, it also made another important connection that blurred the distinction between the violence of the South, but also the violence of the North, saying, I'm going to quote part of the introduction of the petition, quote, "There was a time when racist violence had its center in the South. Once, most of the violence against Negroes occurred in the countryside, but that was before the Negro immigrations of the 20s and 30s. Now there is not a great American city, from New York to Cleveland or Detroit, from Washington, the nation's capital, to Chicago, from Memphis to Atlanta or Birmingham, from New Orleans to Los Angeles, that is not disgraced by the wanton killing of innocent Negroes. It is no longer a sectional phenomenon. Once the classic method of lynching was the rope, now it is the policeman's bullet. To many an American, the police are the government, certainly its most visible representative. We submit that the evidence suggests that the killing of Negroes has become police policy in the United States, and that police policy is the most practical expression of government policy." Close quote. In linking the new language from the Second World War of racism and genocide, the hope was to bring attention to the scenes of subjection where Black death was conducted and ritualized. In phase 2 of the usages of genocide, the term seems very much to be reconceptualized, to generally include any and all expressions of oppressions under the term. It also seems more complicated as it comes along with the expansion of Black rights, whether it's the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, and the formal inclusion into the nation. To that point, what does it mean to use the term as We Charge Genocide, the activist group in Chicago did, with a Black president and the highest concentration of Black political power in American history? It also raises the question of what is gained and what is lost in this strategy. And while in the first phase, the use of the term was connected with a broader activist campaign, including the We Charge Genocide petition, what were the organizational or campaign-oriented aspects of its use in the second phase? Sam Ng's paper, They Came to See Him, Emmett Till's Funeral and the Making of Race, also attends to Black death as an organizing event. Both Ng's and Kucik's paper respond to the internal and external mobilizations to confront the terror of Black death. In Ng's paper, he explores the radicalizing impact of Emmett Till's murder and funeral and the mobilization that develops in its aftermath. At the heart of his paper is the question of what does it mean to bear witness and what are its consequences? For African Americans in this post-war moment of possibility overlaid with the potential of terror, the funeral and most poignantly, the open casket of Till pulled those antipodes of possibility and terror together in such a way that helped to spawn a direction in Black struggle. This new direction would be fueled by the intensity of the reaction of Black young people who now bore witness to the death of a peer and the reality that their youth and presumptions of innocence would not save them. Ng describes this process of recognition and awakening as one of making race, based in the collective experiences of Black people. With that said, the sense of collectivity should not be collapsed into universality or other essential categories that work to narrow Blackness into a single thing. For example, when Ng writes of the apparent hostility of some Black Southerners to Till for essentially being the cause of his own death, this is accepted as a way Black Southerners, quote unquote, expressed fear for their children. Undoubtedly, that was true for some people, but I would suggest that we move away from categorical knowledge and presumptions of who the Black Southerner or the Black Northerner is assumed to be. I would argue that there has never been a universal Black Southern experience, but that it was riven by differences of region and work, food, religion, class, experience, agency, expectation, hope, and hopelessness. It was not long thereafter, the funeral of Till, that Black domestics in Montgomery, for example, staged a determined protest against busing policies in that city, or that Black students across the South would initiate a wave of civil disobedient protest, both of which worked together to create new terrains of political struggle. This point is not meant to be pedantic, but to say that the creation of race produces different outcomes based on the multiple ways that Black people exist in the world. Of course, there are universal experiences, racism, discrimination, racial terror, but there are also many factors that shape the meaning of those experiences and what to do about them. We have learned this time and time again that rarely is there a universal reaction to these universal experiences. And so how do we bring out the nuanced intentions within Blackness in this country and beyond? Till did bring together the disparate experiences from across the country into a massive confrontation with white supremacy. It was not the beginning of the struggle, but perhaps the crystallization that struggle indeed was necessary. The sclerotic pace of change through the clogged channels of racial liberalism was insufficient for the heightened demands of a radicalizing Black populace. In both of these papers, and including his own, Tyler Davis's invocation of the co-labor of the living and dead makes sense of a particular duality in Black protests. Beneath the debate over the meaning of genocide were countless, as in uncounted bodies of dead men, women, and children, the mangled corpse of Emmett Till, nearly lost to the killing fields of Mississippi, directed a drifting Black movement. And Tyler Davis introduces us to the ghost of Jesse Washington. The history of Washington's lynching has been preserved through what Davis describes as the oral theological storytelling tradition among Black residents in Waco, Texas. This also speaks to the rich regional diversity that confounds categorical notions of place and time in Black experience. The truth that memory does succeed is demonstrated through the contemporary demand for a commemoration for Washington and other victims of lynch law in Waco. But more importantly, in the story of Washington, we see the way ordinary Black people in Waco transforms this particular murder into an indictment of racist whites while morally vindicating Black people as ethically superior through the vengeance of nature, a tornado, or colloquially, an act of God. As in all of these readings, Black victimization is transformed into active resistance in different forms. Here, the ability to re-narrate events against the destruction of Black life into the resurrection of Black life through the physical destruction of the emblems of white supremacy. As Davis writes, quote, "The Waco storytelling tradition performs possibility and disaster." In other words, Black self-activity has a way of, quote, flipping the script. For sure, this is a theme throughout, and that which links the past to the present. In all of these readings, ordinary Black people are transformed from objects of history to subjects of history that struggle for self-determination. That is the right to dictate their lives on their own terms. This is always difficult when your humanity is under assault and assumed to be expendable. But whether through transforming speech, daring to bear witness, or turning tragedy into godliness, Black resistance has many manifestations. Thank you. Okay, so just to begin, I don't know if any of you have questions or commentary for each other.
Just a brief comment that I really appreciated the way that your three papers work together and sort of thinking about co-labor. And you could sort of apply co-labor to each of you, the co-labor of mourning, the co-labor of political practice, of the Black newspapers, and the co-labor that you speak of in terms of Waco. I thought that they worked together really well. So I thank you for them.
I have just a general comment, maybe in response to one of your questions about opening things up. So thank you so much for your comments. It was really helpful. I was trying to write them all down. I think I failed, but I got a significant amount. So regarding one of your questions about the organizing principles, can you hear me? Sorry, yeah. I'm so afraid my voice to be so loud. Can you hear me? Okay. So your question regarding the organizing principles of what I call the second phase of the genocide, the petition to get a verdict of Black genocide, I think could help open up some of your other questions. So there were two connected goals of what I'm calling the two phases. And the larger chapter that this came out of is about 60 pages, so there was so much that had to come out of it. And one of the main things that I struggled the most with cutting out was this connected idea to, so what I called the reconceptualization of genocide, which I think you bring up a great point about maybe what we should call it. But what I talked about was the Black press's attempts to get a verdict of genocide and the ways that they tried to kind of reconceive of the term that would include what was happening to Black Americans. But the next step to that was a reconceptualization of what would a verdict of genocide then mean. So what would you then do? So the ways that a verdict was enacted with the Holocaust was, some members of the Nazi Party were tried, they were put in jail. In Rwanda, similar situation, perpetrators were jailed. Recently, just in 2015, two of the leaders of the Cambodian genocide were placed in jail. So in all of those situations, the verdict essentially resulted in the people being deemed the perpetrators being placed in prison. Because what was happening to Black Americans was in some ways, a different enactment of genocide. The next question is, if we can get a verdict of genocide, what they were asking for was also different. So it wasn't to throw, who would you, the whole country, in jail. It was, in phase one, it was to get lynching outlawed. That was the main goal. But then in phase two, and this is to your question about the organizing principles, a lot of the questions of what would a verdict accomplish were actually hopes for investment in Black communities. And in the discussions paralleled in a lot of ways the recent discussions people have been having about reparations and what would that look like. So some of the organizing principles for the second phase in terms of securing a verdict were about things like investing in Black schools and cutting out mass incarceration, abolishing the war on drugs, unjust prison sentences. So the way that genocide was hopefully going to be abolished and what a verdict would result in that phase was not in the imprisonment of groups of people, but actually a concerted investment in Black communities. And so the organizing principles around that phase revolved around that, whether it was cleaning up, cleaning up neighborhoods. It's very similar to what we see today in terms of cleaning up, water supply in Flint, and those types of things. So the organizing principles for that second phase revolved around that, and I think it's an interesting question to bring up in terms of the next question to obviously what I posed today would be then what, if we did get a genocide, as you said, what is to be gained from it. And I think it's important to point out that what they hoped to be gained was different than what had been gained in the past, which is kind of imprisoning the for a kind of better future altogether that wasn't just based in punishment of a group, but actually improvement and investment in the community.
Okay, I can open it up to the
Thank you all for a fantastic panel. I have sort of a two-part question slash comment. And the first is I thought when Christina, we were talking about, made reference to Evo Landing, and I had this flashback of going to Evo Landing, and that before you get to actually where Evo Landing is, there's a sign that says private property, because you have to sneak onto Evo Landing now. And this question of property seemed to course, and I hope I'm not revealing myself as too much of a vulgar Marxist, but this question of property seemed to kind of course as a subtext for that, right? So that, and it's a vexed question, so that, both in the case of Emmanuela and Emmanuela's work on genocide, it is the case that having access to property actually becomes a mechanism for not just sort of forming these arguments against domination, but actually establishing the kind of archives that we use to recuperate truth. Even as the proper regime is also responsible for sort of taxing people off of ships, right? So I'm interested in how you all are thinking about the negotiation of property, and then similar to the question of sort of legal political recognition, right? So that it's very hard for me actually to separate out Emmett Till from Brown, because it is precisely, so if we look into history of the Black press, there's constant discussions about organizing in response to racial violence, right? But what happens is different is that Brown is a signal that there will be the possibility of appeal to the nation state for some way, right? And so you have, now, we have also this knowledge of the topics, so for example, the charge genocide petition, that it will likely fail, right? The appeal to law, but there's a sign that something might be different. And so this sort of vexing relationships to the structures of economic domination and the structure of law, that on the one hand sort of is what enables, if not remedy, the sort of organizing and articulation of a certain liberation vision, even as we know that these institutions will fail. And I'm just wondering how you're thinking about that intersection, all of you.
Thank you. That was an excellent question. Lots to think about. In terms of the idea of producing an archive, that's very central to my work. I'm also interested in how bodily performances create archives, repertoires, as Diana Taylor has argued, in addition to literal, physical, tangible archives, including the photographs of Emmett Till and all of the Black press response, which is also part of creating an archive of memory, which was very central to Mamie Bradley's project as well. In terms of Brown, absolutely, there's no doubt that Brown was this fundamental watershed moment, and there have been scholars who have argued that Emmett Till's very death was closely connected to the Brown backlash. I mean, after all, in 1955, there had not been an officially recorded lynching since 1951, but in the wake of Brown, what we see are the developments of many citizens' councils, as well as multiple lynchings in Mississippi prior to Emmett Till. So absolutely, there's no question about that. I think I was interested in the kind of affective, felt sense of the time among people. And so that's why I took Reverend Jackson's words about how Brown was this moment, and yet it didn't seem like it trickled down to people. People didn't feel necessarily like things had changed in the wake of Brown for many years. And so I was kind of interested in that, as opposed to something like Emmett Till, which had this tremendous affective impact on people, especially Black people at the time. So I think I was kind of interested in that, but absolutely, I mean, there's no doubt in terms of property, the production of the material archive, the legal changes. After all, in the wake of Emmett Till's killing, you finally have the kind of momentum for the building of the '57 Civil Rights Act. And so absolutely, I think that's also in relation to Brown versus Board.
Okay. So yeah, thank you so much. Professor raised an excellent question or questions as always. I'll pick up the property question with just a really brief answer, and this might not be the way that you were asking it, but just the way that I was thinking of it. So the role of property in my work and what I'm working on, and the charges of genocide were actually really integral. I talked a lot, just for the sake of simplifying for the paper, the petition as talking about lynching and actual murders, but there are significant, there's multiple sections, both in the introduction and in the petition in general, where they talk about how not all genocide results in the death of the victims, and they point out how the definition actually says, bringing about conditions of life that are intended to destroy a group. It doesn't necessarily say that the group must be destroyed for it to qualify. And one of the examples that threads throughout the petition is the destruction of Black property. So there are deaths that result, and they do talk about Black houses being bombed, Black houses being set on fire. One of the examples I had in the PowerPoint was of a Black family's home being burned because the white family didn't want them to move into the neighborhood. But even in the instances where the families weren't killed, there is a lot of discussion about the removal of property from Black Americans. So there's a lot of discussions about failing infrastructure in inner cities and how people were forced to live. They didn't have access to property that was sufficient for living, a sufficient life. And so whether that led to homelessness or just to different types of diseases that were being contracted from living in this type of dilapidated property, they were conceiving of this as a form of genocide. And it was considerable thread that runs throughout both through the petition and through just the Black press in general. The lack of access to sufficient property and the removal of Black property, even when, as I said, it didn't result in necessarily death, were conceived of as methods of genocidal violence that fit particularly within the portion of the definition that says bringing about conditions of life intended to destroy or weaken a group. So it's a different way to think about how property plays into these conversations.
I'll just answer very briefly. Thanks, Imani. And that's to say that we know that sort of recognition and reform can also instantiate more harm. And so that we can think about certain kinds of recognition as maybe a shaming mechanism, right? Sort of thinking about, and I'm going to go to an example of certain kinds of prison strikes and demands that aren't necessarily about those demands being met, though it would be fantastic if they were met, but they are also about a kind of awareness of conditions, right? Creating an awareness outside of the prison itself, of the conditions in the prison. So sort of thinking about what happens then in terms of a kind of refusal of the logics of financialization and what can be made laterally. So sort of thinking about, so there's the financial impetus for those people who are smugglers and bringing people across the Mediterranean, which we know means that it doesn't matter if they live or die, right? Because they got their money. And so what can be made, like in the example that I end with, of those who insist on the sort of preservation of life? So what other kinds of ethics can be practiced as a refusal to the logics of property? That's how I'm thinking.
Thank you, Dr. Perry, for your question. I guess what I can say, in terms of trying to read this tradition is, I think one of the differences I'm trying to name between memorialization and the stories of the tradition, it doesn't seem to be too interested in political recognition, at least internally to the story. I think maybe this, there might be room, I think there needs to be room to sort of situate it right within what else is going on, a larger kind of historical perspective. But I think maybe that's what I'm trying to name by saying there's kind of the memorialization on the one hand, and there's naming Jesse Washington's presence on the other. And maybe it's a question as to, is that presence being put to sort of political work in a certain sense, or is it not? But where his name is identifying it with the tornado, but I'm not sure.
So we have time for one more question because we're actually over time, but there's a long lunch break, so hopefully people will have an opportunity to continue to engage with the panelists. Yes?
I had a question on, actually this is part of two. So this idea of bearing witness, and it's particularly brought about by Dr. Sharpe, that image that you have of Dana Schultz's painting of Emmett Till, because that was very controversial, and you had a lot of black artists who have been protesting that and saying like she has no right to paint this, and she has nothing to say about black trauma. And so this idea of like who is allowed to bear witness, one, and Samuel, I think you also addressed it a little bit about your work, like white participants to Emmett Till's funeral, and this idea of like who is allowed to see, and then bear witness also in like the colloquial black church context, as in like speak prophetically to these issues. So like who is allowed to do that? And the other idea I was thinking about is just this idea of genocide or this idea of white supremacy being almost natural or elemental in a sense, whereas it takes on a form of nature, as in a tornado, or as in an earthquake, or as in the waves of water, and how when we think about it like that, is it helpful, is it harmful to think about it as such, as something that's uncontrollable, something that is always a part of the earth and our interactions with it? In what ways does it shape that thinking?
Thank you for the question. So I'll answer quickly both parts. I'll start with the second part. So for me, sort of thinking about the weather is not that it is not then produced by human encounter, right? I mean, we can think about climate change and all the way down the road, right? I mean, and you can think about the kind of changes in soil from overproduction and slavery, as well as bodies buried there, etc., right? So I think that for me to think of the weather is not to think of it as outside of some kind of human change. It's all about all of that, right? Different ecologies being made. So that's the first part. The second part is that for me, it's not about who's allowed to witness, right? But it is about, so thinking about the Dana Schutz painting, it is about what kind of intimacy is actually being activated there, right? Because not everybody has an innocent before knowledge of those images. And so for me, it's Dana Schutz should be moved by Emmett Till's murder. Dana Schutz should be trying to do some kind of reparative work in relation to that. And so it's not a question of allowance, it's a question of how one is positioned, and it's a question of what that work is actually doing. And if, as I've said in a Q&A, that art is also a conversation or an argument, then once you make that argument, you have to be prepared to be engaged in the argument. And so for me, that's the real question.
I've been talking about this painting for a long time as well, so I have a lot to say, but I think I just echo what Professor Sharpe was saying about, it's more about the work that is being done. I also think in terms of allowance, I mean, the fact is she made the painting, she did it, and so I think it's in part, it's about an enactment and what's the work that does. I mean, when Bob Dylan sang about Emmett Till, he also was very explicit. He said, I'm appropriating this and I'm gonna do it. And so, but of course, black activists and black writers and artists do that same thing. John Weidman, when he's writing about Emmett Till's father, had to really think deeply about whether he, as a black man, could use fiction to intersect the lives of Emmett Till and Lewis Till and Mamie Till. But he was much more thoughtful in general than Dana Schutz is, because he really had this, he reflected deeply about it. But then again, that's also the form of literature to allow for that kind of reflection and make it manifest. So I think it's more about what kind of work is it doing, and what's the process behind that potential empathy, because I would like to think that there's moments for solidarity that can be built across difference.
I was just going to say one more thing, that I think, to echo what Sam just said, that I think it would be great to sort of take Dana Schutz at her word. She felt empathy, and then to say, okay, and then what? And how does that empathy work? We know how empathy works. We know that it can often evacuate the actual subject and replace it with yourself. Because for you to say, I'm a mother, is to clearly not understand what it means to be black mother, right? So, but I think take her at her word, and then engage from there.
Okay, yeah, my response wasn't to the painting, it was just to the last question you had posed about naming white supremacists as, so natural and innate, and is that helpful or harmful? And I think you can go both ways with that, but just the importance of naming. One of the things that I was trying to get across in my paper, I think that the Black Press was trying to get across, is even, as Professor Perry was saying, even knowing that these petitions, for instance, to get a verdict of genocide probably are not going to be successful. I think they knew that going in. They certainly knew that after, and they continued calling it genocide. But there's something about the intentionality that's built into the term, and the idea that genocide is actually attempting to destroy a group of people that carries a weight with it that, regardless of whether the verdict was successful, did generate some international attention, especially in the midst of the Cold War. And even if they didn't get the verdict, just continually calling it that, there's just something about naming it as something very intentional, something that's made up of people's deliberate choices, which is not to say that all the things we think of as institutions, as Professor Perry pointed out so beautifully, more beautiful, more terrible, that institutions are made up of people, they're made up of choices. But there's something about the word genocide that conveys choice and deliberate decision-making in a way that other words don't, even if they should. I mean, there's a lot of contention around whether genocide should have the weight, the word should have the weight it does. Why is genocide so condemned and crimes committed within war are not? But I do think that naming it that carries a certain importance and a certain weight with deliberation and intent that is important to keep in mind in other contexts too when we're talking about what we're calling these types of violences.
I would just say in agreement with that it's also, it's not just an external expression, it's also internal, because it provides a language and a structure for Black people to be able to articulate what is happening to Black people, especially at a time where Black death is either ignored, or there are multiple ways of justifying it that have to do with the inferiority and disposability of Black life. And so part of what I think is very powerful about the We Charge Genocide method of organizing is that it's also about creating a way for ordinary Black people to be able to describe institutionally and externally what is happening to Black people that is not about the self-destruction of Black communities or the biological inferiority of Black communities, but that it puts a name and structures and organization behind what is happening in African American communities across the country. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.